Welcome to AETCM, the emergency medicine channel. Today we will be discussing about trigger. So what is trigger? Trigger is a variable that determines the start of inspiration. So what do you mean by that? So whenever a patient is attempting to take a breath, that is called as a trigger, that is patient is triggering a breath. So ventilator will sense accordingly and will be supporting the patient. So there are different types of trigger, that is time trigger, there is pressure trigger, there is volume trigger, and there is flow trigger. So some basic settings are time trigger. So that means we will be setting a respiratory rate. So depending on that respiratory rate, the ventilator will be triggering the breath, not the patient. The ventilator will be triggering the breath to the patient, and it will not be sensing the patient's respiratory effort. Depending on the respiratory rate we are setting, the ventilator will provide the breath to the patient. Okay, so suppose we are keeping the respiratory rate as 12, so the ventilator will provide breath in every 5 seconds. So that is a time triggered mechanism, and it depends on the settings which we are providing. So the disadvantage is, since it is not sensing the patient's trigger, it is not very good for weaning the patient. Some other trigger mechanism as pressure trigger and volume trigger and flow trigger. So what is pressure trigger? Suppose we have a ventilator which is having a pressure trigger to set. So this I have a Hamilton ventilator, this is sensing the flow trigger, but if you are having a pressure trigger, depending on the difference in pressure, the ventilator will sense that patient is taking a respiratory effort and will support the patient. Okay, so we can set a pressure as -5 centimeters of water or -1 centimeter of water. So depending on the pressure we are setting, the ventilator will sense the whatever effort the patient is taking, and that will support the patient. Suppose the patient is taking a respiratory effort. So in order to take a inspiration or to take a breath, the patient will have to create a negative pressure in the patient. So one negative pressure will be coming. So suppose we are setting the pressure trigger as -1 centimeter of water. So if the patient is taking -1 centimeter of water of effort, so that negative pressure will be sensed by the ventilator, and ventilator will support that. And if we are keeping it as -5 centimeter of water, so that patient should take that much effort, so that much negative pressure will be coming in, and that will be sensed by the ventilator, and the ventilator will be providing the breath. So as the sensitivity, as we are setting the pressure more negative, the ventilator sensitivity will reduce and the patient will have to put more efforts, so that the ventilator will sense the trigger of the patient. Okay, so and then we will be discussing about the other trigger, that is flow trigger. So what is flow trigger? Flow trigger is more beneficial or more better than pressure trigger, because the ventilator will be sensing the difference in the flow of the ventilator and the patient circuit, and depending on that it will be providing breaths to the patient. So a ventilator will be sensing the difference in flow, not the pressure. Okay, so it is better than the pressure trigger. So we have a Hamilton ventilator here. It is having, in the controls we are having flow trigger. Okay, flow trigger we can set from 0.5 liter per minute to 20 liter per minute. So I've kept that flow trigger very minimum 0.5 liter per minute, and we can increase up to 20 liter per minute. Okay, so usually when after intubating a patient, we usually keep the flow trigger as 5 liter per minute. That means there should be a difference in flow of 5 liter per minute than what is given by the ventilator, so that the ventilator will sense the patient's trigger. So usually we will keep it as 5, and whenever we are trying to wean a patient of the ventilator, we will reduce the trigger and keep. So we will be reducing the trigger to somewhere around 2. So after intubation we kept it as 5, and then whenever we are trying to wean the patient, we will be reducing it and setting it as 2. So Even there is a change of 2 liter per minute, the ventilator will sense that and it will support the patient, and it will support the trigger of the patient and will provide a breath. Okay. So how does the ventilator sense that? So usually what is happening is there is a continuous flow in the ventilator. There is a delivered flow and there is a return flow, and usually a return flow and delivered flow will be equal. But suppose if the patient is triggering for a breath, the delivered flow will be more than the return flow. That means the return flow will be reduced. So that change in flow is sensed by the ventilator, and ventilator will trigger the breath. Okay. So that is how we set the trigger. So as I told before, immediately after intubation we will be putting the patient on a, suppose any mode, that is CMV mode, pressure support mode, any mode we are putting the patient depending on the need for the ventilation. That means depending on the indication why we have intubated the patient, we can plan how long we have to keep the patient on a ventilator. Suppose we just intubated the patient for a imaging purpose and all, so we can put the flow trigger initially as 5, and whenever we are planning to wean the patient, maybe like after 1 hour or 2 hours, we can reduce the flow trigger and we can plan on weaning the patient. Suppose if we have intubated the patient for a IC bleed or something, and we don't want the patient to trigger and we don't want an asynchrony for the patient, so we will be keeping the flow trigger high so that there will not be a change in the flow, so that the patient can be in the so that the ventilator can fully take over the patient and the patient is not allowed to trigger, so that weaning can be delayed. Okay, I hope you have understood. Thank you.